Recently, in my free time at home and also live on my painting stream, link in the description, I painted up the Grand Sith Inquisitor for my Star Wars Shatterpoint Force. This was actually the first time I was exposed to the concept of a Jedi Hunter, aside from Darth Vader, of course, and I freaking love it. Coming off the back of Order 66, these kin killers are my kind of sauce. I love the off-scheme white armor I went with, but the problem with this execution was that it took me more than 8 hours to paint this single miniature. So I want to see if I can improve on that time while still capturing the look and feel. Aiding me today in my speed painting attempts will be my own set of speed painting skills and several tips from today's sponsor we'll hear more about later. Let's get into it. One thing that's challenging about the scheme I've chosen is that it's very clean. Often speed painting benefits from some amount of weathering to obscure and distract from an intentional lack of effort on other parts of the miniature. A great example might be adding mud to the boots of your miniature to create visual interest while not having to lose time highlighting such a minor detail. Sadly, we'll have to do mostly without this trick today, so what will our approach be? I have 3 Inquisitors today to test different ideas with, so let's start with number 1. The Fourth Sister, or as I called her in my notes, Orange Bay. Our main approach with all 3 tests is going to be to focus our efforts on a couple of elements to engage the viewer while giving much less attention to the rest of the model. This is a cornerstone technique for speed painting and one that is visited often in the speed painting volume supplied by today's sponsor. To shave some time, we'll skip priming and base coat right away with an acrylic paints, in this case, a nice dark blue from scale 75 called Deep Blue. The white armor of my Grand Inquisitor lives in the cold spectrum, and this base coat will help with that. Following that up, we'll apply a zenithal coat with some Tamiya Gloss White. I thinned this for the airbrush with Tamiya X20A, they're thinner. I've been experimenting with this white instead of traditional acrylic whitening because when dry, it doesn't reactivate with water like ink sometimes does. Additionally, like ink, this version of Tamiya's white is glossy, so our next steps will be assisted. Make sure to reach as close to pure white as possible on the upper portions of the model without blasting the entire mini and losing all our blue. The closer we are to white where it matters, the easier future highlighting steps will be. With the airbrush, I'll reintroduce some of that blue with a transparent paint from GW called Guilliman Glaze. It's really easy to overdo the white when trying to reach max opacity. I want to be able to see some of that blue from a tabletop perspective when all is said and done. Otherwise, what's the point? I intend to use these as gaming figures after all, and if a step of my paint plan isn't serving that use case, it should go. This blue also helps to hide some of that airbrush grain if it occurred in the last step. With our armor looking okay, it's time to add in some definition with a Payne's Gray oil wash. As aforementioned, the gloss of the Tamiya white helps with the capillary action of the oil wash, allowing us to get nice definition without needing to do tedious recess shading with acrylic paints, like I did on the first paint job. After some air drying, I hit the model with AK's Ultra Matte finish to lock in that oil wash and proceeded with more acrylics. I created a couple of mixtures of paint on my wet palette. Basically a gradient of cool whites to use at my discretion based on what part of the model I was painting. If it was a lower, more blue element of white, I used a darker color to highlight, and on the higher parts, I used a more pure white to highlight. The further from white the upper body is, the more layers of paint we'll need to build up that pure white. This is why I said to get as close as you can to pure white so that we can shave time off during this stage, which is one of the longer steps. The less layering we have to do, the better. I wasn't feathering or wet blending, just applying layers of semi-translucent paint that I achieved by mixing water into my paints. Nothing fancy, but it does require some practice to know how much to dilute the paint so you get the coverage you're after. As with all light paints, multiple layers, even of pure white, are required because the paint is translucent and dims as it dries. Remember, the white armor and the face is where we're spending the lion's share of our time, so build up adequate brightness where the airbrush failed on these parts. If you're curious, I'm using Yosonia's titanium white for my highlighting on all 4 of my Inquisitors in this video, and I'll have it linked in the description along with other tools and materials if you want to pick something up. While I had pure white in my brush, I amped up the undercoat on this Inquisitor's face, as I'll be leveraging contrast paints for the orange skin. That idea was inspired by the speed painting guide authored by Andrea Macias and Javier Garcia in Volume 2 from this video's sponsor. With the orange skin shaping up nicely, I began to improve it by applying some layers of orange and orange mixed with off-white yellow. Again, this is the part of the model you want to spend some time on, so don't feel like you have to rush. I focused my highlighting efforts on the left side of the fourth sister's face, as it was angled up toward the theoretical sky, our main light source. I find having some drama versus a more clinical highlighting job creates more of that visual interest we're always seeking out when speed painting. Adding some texture to her head tentacles is another easy way to add more of that interest where the Mini doesn't have any sculpted detail. I did the same on her white tunic. With some more of that contrast paint, we'll paint the fatigues of the model. Luckily for us, the cold white gradient we needed for our armor is an excellent base coat for contrast paints. Despite that, contrast paint still dries very quickly and is difficult to get perfect looking in one shot. So with some gray paint, I added one layer of highlights to deal with some of that very dark and awkward pooling in the recesses. I'm using the same paints for these highlights as I was for the white highlights, but just using a higher percentage of black this time. This keeps most of the elements of the paint plan nice and cold, which makes the orange skin and future red elements that much more poppy. For the silver, because there's so little of it, I did a very basic base coat and wash. I'm intentionally using GW's new black wash as it's very glossy and keeps the metallics nice and shiny. Then, with some red and yellow paint, I picked out some of the little buttons and other sci-fi gobbledygook you see adorning the costumes of Imperial soldiers in the Star Wars universe. I also painted the stripe on her gown red like the red stripes on my Grand Inquisitor. These were simple base coats with no layering. I find that differentiating parts of the model, even with a base coat, helps lift up the entire paint job a lot. Now onto the weapon. I applied a similar gradient to the lightsaber with the airbrush earlier in the paint plan that mimicked the original paint job on the Grand Inquisitor, so that all I had to do was apply a few layers of red ink to get the same effect. While I didn't get as punchy an effect, it still kind of works, and it took literally 44 seconds. Lastly, I'll just sharpen up some of these chest and face details where the oil wash or my lack of knowledge and skill failed me a bit. I'm only doing this on the front of the model and on the upper parts. Again, focus your efforts where it counts. Stick her on a base, and in 52 minutes and 10 seconds, we have this. It's strange. Looking at the paint job in a vacuum, I'm a little disappointed. Experience tells me that when I have all four painted up and arranged together in a unit, I'll be much happier, however. Before we get on to trial number 2, let's hear a brief word from this video's sponsor that's been helping us with our speed painting efforts. Colorful Kraken Studio is kickstarting Miniature Painting Made Easy, a 3-book collection. One for beginners that will help you lay the groundwork for your miniature painting skills, or if you want to revise some fundamentals as an intermediate painter. There are no prerequisites needed to dive right into this resource and start learning. The second volume features world-renowned painters and their methods for painting a model in 90 minutes or less, and features tutorials from award-winning painters like Andy Wardle, David Aroba, Steve Garcia, and more. There are 20 tutorials in this book alone, and the author list is absolutely stacked. These tutorials help me align my speed painting expectations with other painters that have similar backgrounds as me in display painting. Furthermore, it's just cool to see everyone's unique take on speed painting, and while there are some similarities, everyone has different quality levels they're shooting for, different corners they're cutting, and more. In the third volume, we see more speed painting tutorials, but featuring tools and materials used less in the miniature painting world, like oil paints. This book features authors like YouTube's very own 52 Miniatures, Arnaud Lazaro, Kendon Oates of Grimdark Compendium, and others. The books have two goals: inspiration and education. Inspiration because the tutorials are from some stellar hobbyists and it's easy to be inspired by their strategies and color choices. Education because the volumes present information in small pieces that will help you level up your painting even if you don't strictly follow their tutorials. In addition to the books, you'll find 3 models that are also included in the Kickstarter to use as test models when applying the ideas found in these volumes. Thank you to Colorful Kraken Studio for sponsoring this video and speeding up my painting. If you're interested in any of the volumes, you'll find the campaign linked in the description below. On to trial number 2, who I lovingly called Big Boy, and I have a confession to make about Big Boy. This model is sculpted after the 5th brother, and if I'm being totally honest, I am not a fan of that helmet. The chin strap makes him look like a giant toddler. Because of this, I had my friend Jordan of Skullforge Studios, who sculpts many awesome alternate minis for Star Wars Legion, create a few heads for me. The one I went with is the head of another Sith Inquisitor, the sixth brother, whose model currently doesn't exist in Shatterpoint and hopefully never will, because then it'll get a little awkward. Leave your disgust for my utter disregard for Star Wars lore in the description below. I'm going to gloss over details of this paint job that were identical to the last one, so if I skip something, that's why. Our Inquisitor mashup started similar to our prior attempts, except this time I only did one layer of dark blue paint for my base coat. I always wonder how important it is to actually get full opacity all over the model for a base coat like this that'll end up largely getting covered. Let's find out together. This may seem trivial, but if you're batch painting 20 dudes, that time adds up. After a layer of Tamiya white applied through the airbrush, we can see that applying one layer of the original dark blue was more than enough for this test. Now we're going to mix it up a lot. I've only ever used oil paint in a washing capacity, but today, for the first time on the Miniac channel, I'm going to apply full-fat, undiluted oil paints to a miniature. With a small brush, I started to dab little spots of Payne's Gray oil where a shadow would collect most intensely, and then with another small yet soft brush, I feathered that oil paint out, and boy howdy, was this so much fun. I have never done this before, and it felt pretty straightforward. Likely you already knew, but oil paint is so much less fussy than dealing with acrylics. I felt like the large armor panels of this model really lent itself to this technique. I was able to get such intense contrast without getting overspray on other parts of the model, like if I were doing this step with an airbrush. I was inspired to try this out because of Matteo Di Diomede's speed painting guides in volume 3 from this video's sponsor. In his example, he was using the oil paint to add visual interest and shading through weathering, whereas in my case, I'm just shading with it. Due to my inexperience, however, I had a little problem to solve. I was in the process of adding oil shading to this Inquisitor, and I obviously messed up the shoulder pad here. Now, I'm not gonna time fixing this one shoulder pad because in an ideal world, you wouldn't make that mistake. But I thought in fixing this issue, we could do another experiment. I made my way over to Blick this morning and picked up some white titanium oil paint to do the exact same thing we were doing with the shading yesterday, but with the highlighting today. Let's see if that can solve our problem on the shoulder pad, and if it looks good, I might apply it elsewhere on the model. It's not totally fixed, but 1 or 2 rounds of that and we should be golden. Turns out I did have a ton of fun fixing the shoulder pad, and I intensified the white armor of other parts with more oil paint, but then my speed paint came to a screeching halt when I realized that now I have to wait for oil paint to dry. Go figure. Unlike my typical oil washes that are heavily diluted with mineral spirits, straight up oil paint takes significantly longer to cure. I consulted some experts and was told 48 hours is enough time to wait, and in some cases 5 days. I don't got that kind of time, so instead I yeeted the model into my UV curing station for my 3D printer to see if I could speed up that timeline. With about 4 hours in the UV chamber and another 20 hours of dry time overnight, I held my breath and applied a matte varnish the following day. Future Scott here to say that so far nothing bad has happened with the test, but your mileage may vary, so do some tests if you decide to use oil paint. With the paint dry, I added some white edge highlights with some acrylic paint and also some selective recess shades where the oil wash wasn't fully opaque. I'm not going around the whole model and outlining every detail or highlighting every edge with these steps. I'm just focusing on the important parts around the face, shoulders, and chest, and also prominent details that are visible when viewing the model from the front. Like this bit of thigh armor, for instance. The contrast paint worked great for the fatigues this time, so it didn't require any extra highlighting, but I did add some recess shading on this prominent right forearm because the detail wasn't captured as well. For the face, the fifth brother normally has white skin, so I went with a warmer off-white look. I could have just used the undercoat with a couple of highlights, but I wanted to differentiate this white from the white of my armor by using temperature contrast. For the LEDs on his suit, I took inspiration from the extra highlights we added to the face of the fourth sister, our first speed painting attempt, and first painted them opaquely with white. I then painted them with red contrast paint and yellow ink, and that made them nice and poppy. Lastly, because the lightsaber was lackluster on the last test, I decided to paint this saber similar to how I did the Grand Inquisitors. This was basically some rough wet blending from black to red to white with an emphasis on the red. The last lightsaber I painted took around 44 seconds compared to this trial's 5 minutes and 30 seconds, but it does look so much better, and it's such an iconic feature of the model that's important to invest a little bit more time. Toss that sucker on a base, and we have another completed Jedi Hunter in 58 minutes and 21 seconds. I had so much fun with oil paints on this guy. Again, I feel like his large, flat armor panels really lent themselves to that method, and maybe something like a tank or a walker could really take advantage of oil paints. I want to paint up a Dark Eldar vehicle now with oil paints, but instead, I have to be an annoying adult and finish writing this script and painting another Inquisitor and then edit this video before I can have fun. Boo. Speaking of, on to Riva, our final speed paint of this video. Fresh off the presses of playing Jedi Fallen Order, I was very excited to paint the second sister, especially after I chopped off her head and gave her that beautiful helmet from the comic books and video game. It did take me more than a couple of times to nail the scale, however. Again, I'll only mention where the paint plan deviated from the previous attempts. For the white zenithal highlight, I went back to good old faithful white ink because I wanted to use a tip from Will Hahn that I found in the second speed painting book from this video's sponsor. White ink has a tendency to reactivate with products like washes, glazes, and even water. To prevent this, I added in a glazing medium, which I am doing here. Because mine is so thick, I also mixed in some airbrush thinner. Maybe it's due to a lack of experience with Tamiya white, but I think I get smoother results with acrylic ink when compared, but I'm not sure. Let me know in the comment section what kind of experience you've had airbrushing Tamiya paint versus acrylic inks. On Riva, I had a bit of a learning lesson with oils. I did my standard panel lining, but I used 2-day-old paint at this point, thinking nothing of it. It seemed to work normally until I tried to clean it up. The oil paint set up extremely fast and I was unable to remove it even with a brush using pure mineral spirits like shown here. Keep that in mind if you use oil washes in the future. Also, that white ink is holding up incredibly well to my abuse, so thanks for the tip, Will Hahn. For my shading, I wanted to capture some of that lovely teal color in the shadows that I've been missing from my original paint job, and to do that, I busted out some express paints from Vallejo and did some mixing. Oh, what's that? You love my cutting mat? Well, thank you. You can pick up this chonky double-sided boy on my web store, Miniac.co. My plan was to glaze the teal-blue mixture onto the shadows to hide some airbrush fuzz, deepen the contrast, but to also get that nice teal shadow that was on my original Grand Inquisitor. However, my brush went on a different path. Sometimes while making videos for YouTube, you paint in ways that aren't normal, using very discrete steps, making painting a lot easier to follow, but sometimes less natural for the painter. Here, I'm painting as I always paint, flowing between shadow, midtone, highlight, using various dilutions of paint, doing an edge highlight here, a recessed shade there, etc. I'm including all the brush strokes for the chest portion of the model here in this video because it's hard to describe exactly what I'm doing. I've mixed up 3 tones on my palette and have a variety of dilutions at my disposal, kind of similar to the first speed paint trial. I'm working through each panel at a time, making sure it has proper contrast, sufficient blending, and good edge highlights and recessed shading. Again, I'm doing absolutely none of this to the back of the model, and I'm doing simpler versions of this to the perimeter of the model, like her forearm armor. This part of the paint plan took almost 30 minutes, but I think it's the closest I've gotten to the original paint plan without taking forever. It makes sense though that it took so long, however, because I'm basically doing multiple steps in one. Here is the complete white armor, and you can see how the back got less attention than the front. I basically didn't highlight the cloak, hip armor, or her butt flaps at all. For the leather, I sadly wasn't able to get it done in one base coat of Basilicanum Gray, so I did some more highlighting, except this time I used warm gray instead of whatever was on my palette. I took some inspiration from the face of the prior Inquisitor's test. It's like a subtle form of temperature contrast, but it helps nonetheless. I also added some stretchy fabric texture to her thighs with this color as well to hide some of my bad blending with subtle texture. That's another great speed painting tip. Use texture where you can. Earlier, I mentioned how I intentionally kept everything other than the lightsaber and red LEDs cold, so they pop out more when painting the first speed painting trial, the fourth sister. Both that approach and also the approach of painting the leather fatigues in a warm gray are valid. You can compare the attempts in the final shots to see which method you prefer. For the LEDs and saber, I took another note from this video's sponsor, Speed Painting Book, specifically from Mateo's guide again on using fluorescent paint. While I was buying oil paint at the art store, I also picked up some red fluorescent paint. Using this paint and some yellow fluo paint I already had for the saber and the LEDs made a nice punchy little difference. Again, we're trying to distract from the other elements of the paint job we're caring less about, and a big attention-grabbing color like fluorescent red does that job great. So thanks for the tip, Mateo. The only thing I added was some red ink on the ends of the lightsaber, as fluo paint doesn't mix with black well. I also used this paint for the eye slit on her visor, except instead of base coating, I thinned it down and basically washed it into the recess. Do that a couple times and it should get bright and saturated enough. In 1 hour and 36 seconds, we have a completed second sister, and I'm well on my way to having a finished Shatterpoint team. I had a lot of fun speed painting Shatterpoint in this video. It's worth mentioning that I also created custom decals for my team, and that was not included in the paint timings, but it does help with speed painting models. Simply more details to be distracted by. Also, in case anyone is curious how I pulled off the red marble, I didn't include that in my timings as well, but it's pretty simple. Source some wet wipes and rinse them out with water and let them dry. Make sure they're the stretchy variety, as some are not. Then really stretch them out, creating large fibrous voids in the material. Then, with a black base, airbrush some white through the mask onto the base, which creates a very convincing and simple marble effect. Then, cover the whole thing in red ink with the airbrush and boom, red marble floors. I did try to use straight up red paint, but that seemed to not work as well, but your mileage may vary. I was probably just being a dingus. For the sake of journalistic integrity, something to keep in mind about this video is that while Reva's paint job was basically as fast as the Fifth Brothers, and also turned out looking better in my opinion, that doesn't mean that the methods employed were better. This is literally the first time I've ever used oil paint on a model in this capacity, and the fact that it came out looking this good with this little time invested means that if I were as well trained in oil paint as I was in acrylic paint, this could potentially look even better than the second sister. If I asked you to mimic how I painted Reva with no experience with acrylic paint, it would probably look like dog shit. That's because acrylic paint is annoying to work with, and I'm only able to tame the beast because I've been using this style of paint for over 20 years. Keep that in mind when evaluating the paint jobs and methods used. I want to take some time to talk about the scheme for my Shatterpoint Inquisitors. I've been consuming a lot of Star Wars media ever since I played my first real game of Shatterpoint on the gaming live stream, VOD linked below. If you're curious, I really enjoyed the game, and we have another one planned on October 5th at 7 p.m. CST at the link in the video description. I've watched some of the shows, rewatched the movies, played video games, and even added some of the comic books to my Amazon wishlist. Something that's so refreshing about the world of Star Wars is that the creators are not afraid to riff on the aesthetic. Back in my day, glossy black stormtroopers, chrome domes, Praetorian guards, and even cooler shit from Ahsoka that I'm not gonna spoil, go watch it, did not exist in the films. While white Inquisitors are not a thing in any media yet, I could absolutely see them doing this in the franchise in the future as some kind of ceremonial garb. The willingness of the creators to change things inspires me and honestly gives me creative license and confidence to mix things up in the Star Wars universe, and you should do the same, I think. That's gonna do it for this video, guys. Don't forget to check out the sponsor for this video and their awesome speed painting volumes, links in the video description. If you're a fan of speed painting, I have several other speed painting videos that I'll link at the end of this video. If you like the channel and you want to support it, there are many ways to do that, all things linked down in the description below, namely a Patreon campaign with a bunch of fun rewards, like a Discord server where you and I can hang out any day of the week and chat about your miniature painting projects, or why lightsabers seem to be the least lethal weapon in the galaxy. You can also use the links in the video description to tools that I recommend. Those are affiliate links, and I get a little kickback and no extra cost to you when you purchase using those links. You can also buy things on my web store at Miniac.co, like this sick cutting mat previously mentioned, a cool tie-dye hoodie, and a model called the Duchess, all things linked down in the description below. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to paint